Germany surrendered on May the 8th, 1945, which was celebrated in the United States as VE Day, Victory over Europe, with Germany and Italy before that being subdued. That meant that the Allied forces were now free to focus all their attention on the Pacific theater and defeating Japan. By the way, I forgot to mention earlier that after the Allies had made their way all the way through Italy, that Mussolini was actually captured by Italian communists and executed by firing squad. So things didn't end so well for him either. Meanwhile, in the Pacific theater, in that same month of May 1945, Australian forces took Borneo, British forces took Rangoon, edging closer to not only the Japanese islands, but also pretty much cutting off the Japanese oil supply. In June, U.S. forces took Okinawa, which is just south of the Japanese islands proper. So, again, knocking on the front door. Then, as they drew closer, and plans were being discussed for a possible land invasion, and we've talked about that before. That was projected to be an extremely bloody affair with a lot of very heavy casualties, both among the Allied forces and among Japanese civilians. However, of course, what the Japanese did not know, and what very few people in the United States knew, was that the U.S. had been working on something called an atomic bomb. And it turns out that even the Vice President, Harry Truman, hadn't been aware of that project. And when FDR died in the late summer, early spring of 1945, and Truman took over, that's the day he found out about it. So, anyway, the Allies were calling for the surrender of Japan. The Japanese High Command knew that they weren't going to be able to win the war, so it was a matter of time before they were defeated, but they wanted to at least set some conditions for their surrender. The U.S. and the other allies, however, insisted that it be an unconditional surrender. The conditions that the Japanese insisted on, there were 4 of them. Number 1, that they could keep the emperor as emperor. Number 2, that they could be responsible for their own disarmament. That is, essentially, we surrender, you tell us to disarm, and we'll oversee the doing of that. Number 3, there would be no occupation of the Japanese islands by Allied forces. And number 4, that the Japanese would carry out their own war crimes trials for any Japanese soldiers who were accused of war crimes, to which the Allies said no dice. Then, on August the 6th, 1945, a U.S. bomber named the Enola Gay dropped the first of 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The 2 bombs were nicknamed Fat Man and Little Boy, and it was Little Boy that was dropped first. The second bomb was actually more powerful. The bomb was dropped. This was very earth-shattering, no pun intended. It was a huge shock to have one of the country's largest cities virtually destroyed with a single bomb. Nonetheless, the Japanese still did not accede to an unconditional surrender, perhaps because they thought this was a one-off thing, that was a horrible bomb, but that may be the only one they've got. So, plans were made to drop another one. Meanwhile, on August the 9th, just after midnight, so actually the night of August the 8th, 1945, the Russians, who were now no longer occupied with trying to defeat the Germans, the Russians declared war on Japan, being part of the Allies, and troops were sent in right after midnight into the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo, otherwise known as Manchuria, in northern China, and quickly defeated the Japanese forces there, took back Manchuria, and also from there took part of Sakhalin Island, which is that island between the Japanese and Russian territory that they had fought over before. So essentially now, the Russians are on the way. That was cause for more concern on the part of the Japanese High Command, and you have to think that it may have also been cause for concern for the United States and Great Britain, because what had happened in the closing days of the war against Europe is that as the Soviets were approaching from the east and they were liberating those areas that had been captured by Germany, places like Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia, they were setting up, or helping to set up, communist governments in those newly liberated nations. And those communist governments, of course, were going to be loyal to the Soviet Union. So there was obviously going to be some fear that if the war continued and the land invasion was carried out and Russia participated, the same thing could happen in Japan. It could have been divided in half with the Soviets controlling some of it, or maybe even all of it. Well, the plan to drop the second bomb, Fat Man, went through later that day, on August the 9th, 1945. It was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. Well, the total casualties for those two bombs in that 3-day period were in Hiroshima roughly between 100 and 150,000 people were killed. Now, there's not an exact number because a lot of bodies were instantly vaporized. In Nagasaki, it was something along the line of 40 to 80,000 who were killed. Despite the fact that this bomb was more powerful because of the hills surrounding that city, the blast was more contained. So 100 to 150,000 on the first one, 40 to 80,000 on the second one, and in both of those cases, roughly half the people who died in the first instant, immediately, were killed. The other half died over the next few weeks and months from intense burns or radiation poisoning. At this point, the Japanese High Command was willing to surrender unconditionally to avoid any further such bombs being dropped on their cities. However, their first condition that they had been planning to call for was still met. The Allies did not call for the end of the seat of emperor, or for the abdication of Hirohito. He was allowed to remain as emperor, in large part because it was felt that that would be so disruptive to the Japanese people. It would be difficult for the occupying force, because the country was in fact occupied by the Allies. It would be difficult to control the people if they went that far. However, there was, not long after the surrender, the requirement laid upon the emperor that he make a radio address to the nation, informing them that he, as emperor, was not a divine being, but was human, which actually the office of emperor for a long time in Japan had been not really a ruling position, because the secular government did the ruling. It was more of a tradition, kind of like the monarchy is in Great Britain now, and it was religious. It was the emperor's the head of the Shinto religion. So part of that whole belief system was that the emperor was directly descended from the goddess of the sun. So by going on the radio and saying that's not actually true, and revealing himself as human, the hope was that that would also tamp down any fanaticism that might still exist among any elements of the Japanese people. But in reality, the Japanese people were really, really tired of this war by that point, and really tired of all the suffering. General Douglas MacArthur wound up in charge of the occupation of Japan, and for the next several years, he was the de facto ruler of Japan, really. He was kind of like filling the office of shogun, the military ruler, which had been an office that really had ruled instead of the emperor for centuries until the 19th century. So MacArthur would oversee the administration of the Japanese government, the writing of the new Japanese constitution. Much like the Germans, the Japanese were not going to be allowed initially to even have a true military. They were allowed to have a defense force, but it was going to be a different world in a lot of ways in Japan after this. In fact, in a lot of ways, it was going to be a different world for everybody post-World War II. And the Allies had been aware of that since well before the surrender of Germany or Japan. In fact, the previous summer, 1944, in July, there had been a meeting in the United States at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, that was attended by the representatives of 45 different nations. Obviously, none of the Axis nations had representatives there, but many of the other countries did, all the Allies did, because after the D-Day, successful D-Day invasion, even though there was still a lot of fighting to do, it was really no longer a question of who was going to win the war. It was a question of how long now was it going to take. So, odds were at this point very, very heavily on the Allies, because they're on the verge of actually invading Germany. So the purpose of this meeting was to sort out the post-war economy and figure out, how things were going to run in this new world that was coming up. A large part of the purpose of this was to ensure that there would be a free flow of goods, that global trade would be unimpeded. So that's an important thing to remember. The most important thing, ultimately, that happened at this conference was the decision was made to no longer base the world economy on the British pound, but to move that and make the international currency standard the US dollar. That's very, very significant. That is kind of a major handing off of powers here. It was basically a statement that the world was changing and the world economy was changing, and Britain was going to the downside. In fact, the U.S. argument here was that with all the colonies that Great Britain had and all the suffering that Britain had gone through in the war, they were in no position to sort of, be the arbiters of the economy. So it was really the American duty to step in, and step in we did. The future of the post-war world was really kind of symbolized by a series of meetings, 3 meetings of what were called by the press the Big Three. That is, the heads of state of the top 3 countries in the Allies, the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. And those heads of state who met for two of those three were Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, Franklin Delano Roosevelt of the United States, and Winston Churchill of Great Britain. The first time they came together was in Tehran in November 1943, shortly after the joint English and Soviet occupation of Iran to secure the Iranian oil fields. At this point, they started having talks about how the war was going to progress forward from late 1943 into the coming year. In February 1945, another conference was held at Yalta to discuss how things were going to be arranged in Europe once Germany finally fell. The final conference of the Big Three was in Potsdam in July 1945. Roosevelt wasn't at that one due to the fact he was dead. He had died in April of 1945. So Harry Truman represented the U.S. there, the new U.S. president, and Winston Churchill was there, but so was Clement Attlee, who had been voted in as the new Prime Minister of Great Britain. So since the two of them were in a transitional period, they both came. But what this really represented was that for the rest of the 20th century, it wasn't going to be Germany that was one of the major players anymore. The major players were going to be the Soviet Union, the U.S., and Great Britain. One could argue that that leaves out a large portion of the world, such as Asia. However, the Chinese leaders weren't invited to this. It really is also indicative of how those Western powers viewed their responsibilities and, one might say, their privileges in the coming New World. China did have a role, however, in the creation of the United Nations, which was created to replace the defunct and ineffective, as it turned out, League of Nations. So China joined the Big Three to make it the Big Four, sometimes referred to as the Four Policemen, that is, the global policemen: Soviet Union, China, U.S., and Great Britain. In April 1945, in San Francisco, representatives from about 50 countries met and drew up a charter that was approved in June of 1945. So unlike Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations, the United Nations, for which Franklin Roosevelt was strongly involved in the creation, did have the United States as a founding member, and in fact it was going to be physically located in the United States in New York City. So here's the situation at the end of World War II. Germany and Japan, which had been major players on the world stage for over half a century, were now in ruins. They had just been bombed to pieces, and their governments were also in ruins. Britain and France, probably the two most powerful nations for the previous couple of centuries or more, were greatly weakened. They were stretched very thin, both of them, in their global empires. Their home countries had also been devastated by the war, not to the same extent as Germany and Japan, but pretty damaged, and they had suffered a lot of losses. The Soviet Union and the United States were stronger and better situated than Britain and France were, although the Soviet Union also took very, very heavy losses during the war and suffered a good bit of destruction. The United States was the leading Allied power that had suffered the least destruction, other than that attack on the naval installation at Pearl Harbor and a very brief incursion by Russian soldiers into Alaska that led to them killing some Inuits, but not staying around for long, and a bomb in a weather balloon that went off, I think, in the Pacific Northwest. Other than that, there were no American cities that were leveled by bombs. A lot of Americans had died. One of the highest casualty rates for any American war. But percentage-wise, it was not nearly as devastating as it was for all the other countries that we talked about, which means that when all is said and done, the United States of America is in the best situation out of all the major combatants in the war. They have become the leading economic power, as indicated by the decisions made at Bretton Woods. They're now the leading political power and the leading military power, considering the fact that they now have atomic bombs and no one else does at this point. There was an expression used of the Roman Empire, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. And that basically was the indication that during the time of the Roman Empire, there was peace because Rome ruled everybody. And there were some people in the U.S., some leading thinkers, who believed that the United States was now going to be in that situation. Not that they would be directly ruling everybody, but that there would be a Pax Americana, which is not a word I just made up. It was an expression that some people were using at the end of World War II, with the idea that the U.S. is now so powerful and so far ahead of the game of everybody else that there's going to be nothing ahead but peace. And I'll let you decide for yourselves how long you think that lasted.